Okay, it's time to get into it. And before we get into it, I want to tell you a story. And this story is very important and happy. I'd say one of the happiest moments of my life. It was the time that I first walked into my SEAL team, my first SEAL team, SEAL Team 3, and my first platoon, India Platoon. And this was going to be in 2000, so it was about the spring of 2000. I had just finished SQT, SEAL qualification training. So that was the 6-month block of training that happened after BUDS. And again, I went through BUDS in 1998 through 1999, so it's quite a while, and the process has changed a bit over time. But ultimately, it's really stayed the same, where you go through the basic training of BUDS, and then you go into advanced training, you go into skydiving and that stuff, and then you get assigned to a team. So I'd been through all of that, and I showed up for the first day walking across the quarterdeck. So for those of you that have never been in the Navy, quarterdeck's the place in the ship that you come aboard. And the team, they called the same thing. So this was a team in San Diego on the Silver Strand. And I remember walking across the quarterdeck and going up to the operations office and getting assigned to the platoon. And my platoon was to become India Platoon. And they told me where to go. So I remember walking over to the platoon space and going up the stairs, and then remember standing outside of this door. And so at this point, I had quite a long path. I decided I wanted to be a SEAL in 7th grade, and then worked nonstop to get to the Naval Academy, and then 4 years of going through some of the hardest college, because not only are you going through college, but you're also in the Navy, going through that, and then having to compete with some of the best people in the country for very few spots to go to SEAL training. They go to SEAL training, it just gets harder from there. Going through all of that, I'm standing there, and my whole future is just waiting for me on the other side of that door. And I remember opening that door and walking in, and now here's all these guys with a lot more experience than me. And I walk in, and the first guy turns to me, and he was this little redheaded guy named Eric, and he looks at me like, "What do you want?" I'm like, "Oh crap, this isn't going well. I'm reporting here. I'm the new third officer here." He's like, "Oh well, you need to talk to the LPO." I don't even know what an LPO is. So LPO meant leading petty officer. So he was one of what would be the first enlisted guy that's got a position of authority. So he's not the most senior, that'd be the chief, but he'd be the guy right under him. So I talked to this LPO, and he turned out to be one of the most amazing guys I'd ever met. And then he introduced me to the chief, and he introduced me to the officer in charge, the lieutenant, and we walk in here. Now, I'm in there for about 10 or 15 minutes, and the senior management's busy in a meeting, so the rest of the guys are sitting there talking. I'm just kind of sitting in the corner, and I'm just listening to their conversation, and they're talking about, and I wish this was a different story, but what they're talking about is how much money would you pay to keep your prized pet dog alive? And they were in a heated conversation. They're arguing about it. One guy's saying, "The dog's here for my pleasure. I wouldn't pay a dime. I'm not even taking him to a vet." On the other end of the spectrum, you had a guy that said, "I'd mortgage my house to make sure that my dog lived." And they're just having an argument about it. And then this was my favorite part. One of the guys said, "Well, what if you had a cat?" And the comment that came out of Eric from that was, "Cats are insects with fur." And it's that point in time that I knew that I belonged. For the first time in my life, I actually felt at home, because I knew that. And I knew every time I'd say something like that, people wouldn't understand or agree. And so the first time in my life that I actually knew that this was where I needed to be. The one thing I didn't know is what role I would play on this team. I knew I fit in, right? A bunch of guys that were definitely not normal. They weren't right in the head, but they sure as hell were effective. And it was over the next 2 years of working with these guys that I got a deep understanding of the importance of role on a team. Not only knowing what your role is, being clear on the definition of that role, the expectations of that role, and most importantly, the behaviors of that role. What behaviors, what actions of the individual are required to fulfill the obligations, to fulfill that role, to add to the team? And it was my opportunity to fulfill the role of follower, to be able to follow, to take action, to fulfill the desired end state, as well as to learn from all of those that had more experience than me. And so what we're going to do now is to give you some absolutely concrete, I mean, these distinctions are top notch. It's taken me years and years of both operating on, leading, and eventually creating high functioning teams, not only in the SEALs, but in my family life, as well as in the business world. And so these are fundamentally applicable. It doesn't matter if you're applying it in the military sense, in a family sense, or in the business sense. The roles of leader, follower, and manager are required for any team. Even if the team is just two people, right? Even in a spousal pair, someone has to hold the role of manager, someone has to hold the role of leader, and someone has to hold the role of follower at some point in time. And really high functioning teams are able to switch between roles quickly, easily, and with very little effort.